Hello everyone. Okay, this video is to address a problem that I guess many of you would have faced when you're writing essays. Okay, specific to part B of an essay. Let's say you're talking about a question on policy solutions. Now, policy solutions can be tested in demand and supply. They could ask you whether a price ceiling is the best way to help low-income families afford food. You could see this in market failure, firms and how they operate, and macroecons, right? Say whether fiscal policy is the best way to address unemployment. So the problem I have that students feedback to me is I get the sense sometimes my E1 overlaps with my R2. Both seem to be talking about the antithesis. So how do I address this problem? Now, an easy solution is if you are looking at a policy question in this format, discuss whether this policy is the best or is the most appropriate in dealing with a certain problem. Your R1 should be policy 1. Okay, so you talk about policy 1 and how it helps to deal with the problem. R2 should be another policy. Now, because of the comparative term most appropriate, best, okay, or only policy, you need to bring in a second policy, right? So R1, how policy 1 works. E1, you rebut R1. You talk about limitations of the first policy. Then in R2, you talk about the alternative policy. E2, you talk about limitations of that policy. So in a way, E1, R2 will not overlap. Of course, it will be nice after you have presented your E1 to write an interim conclusion. Say policy 1 is more appropriate in certain cases. Okay, that interim conclusion also builds towards your summative evaluation towards the end. Now we have a problem if the question doesn't allow us to bring in another policy. So if they ask me to discuss whether fiscal policy, or if they were to ask me to discuss the effectiveness of fiscal policy in dealing with unemployment, notice this question doesn't have a comparative term, right? Discuss effectiveness. So I can't bring in a second policy. What do I do? Now, in this case, I recommend you split the problem. Split the problem, or what I call the dartboard. You split unemployment into, let's say, cyclical, structural, and to a lesser extent, frictional. So your R1 should be how the policy deals with the first root cause of the problem. Say how fiscal policy deals with cyclical unemployment. That's R1. R2, how fiscal policy may or may not deal with structural unemployment. Okay? So push comes to shove, no choice. You have to try to suggest some form of fiscal policy that uses structural unemployment, maybe giving tax incentives for employers to send workers for training. That could be your R2. Then E1, you talk about limitations of fiscal policy in dealing with cyclical unemployment. So once again, R1, how policy deals with the first root cause of the problem. E1, you challenge that. R2, how the policy deals with the second root cause of the problem. E2, you challenge that. Right? So this is another way to avoid overlap between E1 and R2. Okay, that's it. I hope it helps. Next time, I'll probably share more examples of how to come up with R1, E1, R2, E2 in different circumstances. All right, bye-bye.